Well, good morning again, and thank you so much for the invitation, and Pam for all the great work getting me here, and for your recognition of epilepsy and its importance. I was asked to speak a little in reprise of my visit here for a breakfast talk, which I understand many of you didn't hear, but apologies for those who did for any repetition. But I'll speak a little bit about the brain generally and why I think it's interesting, and then more specifically about epilepsy and the problem of stigma. So the brain is a fist-sized mass of soft tissue inside the head, weighing about 1.5 kilograms. It uses only 20 watts of power, and only relatively recently have the number of neurons, the cells that make up the electrically active part of the brain, been counted accurately. And this is one of the remarkable things that really we understand so little about the brain still, that we have only recently arrived at an approximation of the number of active components, and that's thought to be now about 86 billion neurons, each of which has approximately 7,000 connections with other electrically active cells. So the neuron's a remarkable cell, a bit like muscle. It's electrically active, it can be stimulated, and it carries electrical currents much as the wiring in our homes does. These currents are converted to chemical energy, which then carries communications from one cell to the next. These form giant complex networks within the brain, and the intricacies of the connections of these networks are something we're now becoming only just able to understand. And interestingly, a lot of this understanding has come through recognising similar features in the structure of the internet, telephone communications, and how birds flock. Now, there's an enormous amount of storage capacity in the brain. For a long time, it was thought that we might have as much as 3 terabytes of storage in our brains, but this has been revised recently, so it's considered now we have 3 petabytes of storage, and a petabyte is 1 million terabytes. So it's an enormous amount of storage, and the computational power of the brain is such that 64 people are felt to have between their brains the entire computational power of every available device in the world currently. So it's a magnificent machine. So how do we understand it as neurologists? Well, remarkably, still most of our understanding of how the brain works comes through taking a history and understanding the symptoms of disease, and this has been the same throughout the ages, that we listen to the symptoms of people's conditions, and from that 90% of the time we're able to determine the nature of the problem. And then we have special tests, so the physical examination obviously is a good way to find out a little bit more, to try and help confirm what we've deduced from taking a history. And then we have some special tests, and special tests include various types of x-rays and of course electrical tests where we record the brain's electrical activity or the function of the electrical components of the nerves in the limbs. Now, imaging's become very prominent, and because of the power of MRI scanners, which are a very safe and direct way to see how the brain works, we can see much better its structure, but also it's possible to test the function. So a type of MRI scanning, magnetic resonance imaging scanning, involves asking an individual to perform a certain task and then seeing which parts of their brain are active during that. And you'll have seen much in the popular press about centres in the brain being discovered, such as the God Centre and centres responsible for jealousy and so on. A lot of this is guesswork, and unfortunately we're still looking at shadows. So our estimation of what brain is doing during these various tests is still much guided by our relatively limited knowledge currently. So we still see it and understand it mainly through our appreciation of how various diseases affect the brain. And epilepsy was the one which probably provided the greatest insights early on. Areas of brain that are affected by seizures are suddenly overactive. So a short circuit develops in a small area of brain usually, and that area of brain becomes overactive, and we can deduce the function of that part of brain from where the seizure started. In the middle of last century, a very famous Canadian neurosurgeon called Wilder Penfield won the Nobel Prize for work in this area. He was one of the first surgeons to operate successfully on people for epilepsy, and he based this work on that from the century prior of John Hewlings Jackson, a very famous English neurologist who deduced how the brain must be laid out from his analysis of the symptoms of people with epilepsy. So he deduced that if a seizure started in a particular area of brain that produced a sensation or movement in an area of body, that must be what that area of brain is responsible for. And far more complex functions were similarly deduced from his observations. And Wilder Penfield then translated this into being able to accurately determine where seizures were originating and removing that area of brain if possible. But he mapped it so that these operations, shocking though it sounds, are done on people when they're awake. You can numb people to the pain and stimulate their brain directly during these surgeries, which we still do, and this makes the procedure very much more safe, but also lets you understand exactly the results of stimulation. So we learnt a lot through epilepsy of how the brain works, and brain surgery then gave us even greater insights. Does all this, though, tell us how we think and have individual personalities? Not really. We do know that the systems of the brain are enormous dynamic systems which very small changes in can have very dramatic consequences for individuals way beyond what we could possibly anticipate, knowing as we do the structure of the brain currently. An observation made by John Hewlings Jackson, though, was that for the brain to work properly, it must be poised on the edge of catastrophe, electrical catastrophe, continuously, because that maximises its ability to store data and to have spontaneous activity in the way that produces consciousness. And so he came up with the expression that epilepsy is the price we pay for consciousness. So our brain is entirely what we are and who we are. Every manifestation of our personality comes about through our brain. You heard a little before about how we've been involved in some work trying to predict seizures, though, and how this has produced some more insights into how the brain's structured. So networks are very topical now, and networks in the brain are very important. We were able to get some insights into how these networks are built through this predictive work, because we can see that there are systems within the brain which allow the development of seizures, but which also carry information through and allow further seizures. It's become clear through the studies I mentioned around internet communications and other complex moving systems such as bird flocks and fish that the density of networks is very important and the degree of connectivity is critical. There's an optimal degree of connection between these systems so that if the connections are too dense, the information is overwhelming, and if the connections are too sparse, then it can allow sudden and dramatic catastrophic events to develop, somewhat paradoxically. This is very important because in epilepsy the problem fundamentally is too few connections generally. And this allows this particular situation to develop where unpredictable avalanches can develop in the system. And these electrical avalanches are what constitute seizures. Interestingly, these avalanches produce echoes, and the echoes reverberate through these networks. And we can observe these directly in this predictive work, so that what we once regarded as spontaneous and quite isolated events can all be seen to very closely relate to one another and occur in clusters, so that the occurrence of a seizure has effects as its electrical consequences reverberate through the system into the future, causing later seizures to be more likely. So I've spoken a lot about what a very simple, perhaps physical condition it is, governed by complex systems. It's an electrical fault that's caused by anything that can damage the surface of the brain. There are some genetic causes that are important too. These also influence these are genetic problems which influence the electrical connectivity of the brain. So why the stigma? Well, that's a good question. We have a physical illness, no different from electrical faults affecting the heart, for instance, or damage to the nervous system perhaps caused by multiple sclerosis. And yet people are still treated differently. Seizures are seen as a revolting occurrence perhaps. Its episodic nature is perhaps responsible for that in part. Its unpredictability, the disruption that it causes. The Romans called it the disease of the assembly. The physical manifestations might be alarming. People falling to the ground and shaking, frothing at the mouth, biting their tongue and bleeding perhaps. Is that any different though from when people collapse with low sugar from overtreated diabetes? I don't think so, and yet the response of people is fundamentally very different. It's intriguing because this stigma seems to cross all cultural and religious boundaries. It's speculated widely that many leading religious figures suffered epilepsy. Authors have postulated that St. Paul, Muhammad and others all suffered seizures, and this represented an element of their creativity and gave them insight. Others have accused the Bible of perhaps producing the stigma, but I don't think that can be true. I think particularly in the New Testament, as we've heard, its message is quite different about epilepsy. And certainly it's a feature of other religions too, although some shamanic tribes choose their leaders from those who suffer epilepsy, as I mentioned a little earlier. So the prejudice seems to carry across whatever the background. The description in Mark's a marvellous one, and I always provide that example to medical students and others, particularly the phrase, as he falls as often into water as into fire, and the effects so beautifully depicted in Raphael's Transfiguration. Another example of where one can observe directly that the artist must have seen many seizures, the expressions of the people in the crowd, the concern of the parents, the alarm of the onlookers, people pointing. It is all absolutely typical. So the message, I think, in the New Testament has been quite a different one, and most importantly, he saw that it was something that could be remedied. So perhaps what it is, it's the fear of this uncontrolled expression of movement and emotion and the confusion after the event and the sometimes temporarily disturbed behaviour that occurs that really causes the problem. What is clear, though, is that this stigma disables people with epilepsy far more than the seizures themselves. It affects their work, their relationships, their schooling. Every aspect of their life is affected by a condition which might only be present for a few minutes of every year, and yet still it has these catastrophic consequences. So what's the fix? Well, more than ever, we need good thoughts and good deeds and genuine understanding of the condition to remedy this injustice. We need to create our own avalanches of understanding to produce echoes through our own networks that improve the life of people with epilepsy. If I could just finish with a quote from Emily Dickinson. I gave out some more of this poem on the previous occasion, but I think this is a nice one from the late 1800s and provides great insight into the situation of the brain and the condition we've discussed. Emily Dickinson asked, "Is the brain bigger than the universe?" And this has become a serious question. She said, "The brain is wider than the sky. For put them side by side, and one will contain the other, and you beside." Thank you very much.